All right, so I'd like to thank everyone for joining us tonight and just acknowledge the traditional custodians on the lands on which we all gather today and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge that the webinar tonight is supported by the rural city of Wangaratta through funding from the Australian Government Initiative, Communities Combating Pests and Weed Impacts During Drought Program. Our presenter tonight, Brian Sindel, is a professor of weed science from the University of New England in the northern New South Wales city of Armidale, which has a rich history and reputation for agricultural research and teaching. He particularly specialises in weeds of pastoral systems, and together with his students has led Australian research into the ecology and control of over 8 different species, including serrated tussock, Chilean needlegrass, pulletai grass, saffron thistle and winter grass. His research experience spans from natural environment, including sub-Antarctic Macquarie Island for 6 years, as well as many of the rural industries, and he was heavily involved in the 2 national weed cooperative research centres. His favourite weed is fireweed, having completed his PhD on it many years ago, but which remains a hot topic amongst landholders. As well as editing the book Weed Management System, Australian Weed Management Systems, he has co-authored the very popular extension booklet entitled Weed Detection and Control on Small Farms, a Guide for Owners, which we'll also provide a link to that particular booklet with the recording of the webinar. So I'll hand over to Brian and thank you for joining us tonight.
Good. Thanks very much, Landy. It's a pleasure to be able to talk to you this evening about closing the gap on weeds in pastures. And as Landy said, that I come from the University of New England in northern New South Wales. This is just an aerial shot of the campus, and as you can see, it's in a pastoral area on the northern tablelands of northern New South Wales. So I'm not really familiar with the weed species around Wangaratta and the northeastern Victoria. So I'll inevitably need to talk about the principles of closing the gap on weeds in pastures and allow you, hopefully, to be able to apply those principles to your specific situation if you think they're of any use. And at the end of the session, there will be an opportunity for questions, and I think you can type those into the Q&A as we go along at the bottom of your screen. So feel free to do that. I'd welcome any questions that you have. So just to give you an outline of the talk, here are the headings. Why be concerned about weeds? I want to highlight my first lesson about weeds, which I think is pertinent to our discussion this evening. Why do we have weeds in pastures? Understanding our pasture weeds and also understanding our pasture and also understanding our weeds. Then to talk about the 3D look at successful weed management. To also talk about weed removers and pasture improvers, and to ask what is your goal on your particular property, and then think about bringing your plan together, and then questions after that. So why be concerned? Well, left unmanaged or poorly managed, many weeds can become very problematic for both commercial and small-scale farmers. And just one example of that is serrated tussock, which is extremely invasive and virtually inedible to livestock, such that if that's all that livestock have to eat, then, as in this picture, then they will die of starvation. So weeds can be extremely problematic, and left unmanaged or poorly managed, they can cause significant impact on our livelihoods and on the environment. Well, what about my first lesson about weeds? My first memory of weeds as a young boy living in suburban Sydney was of bindii, saliva pterosperma, and particularly of the spines which used to stick into my bare feet as I ran around the garden. And of course they caused a lot of pain. But my father and mother, they were quite dedicated gardeners and worked diligently at removing this weed and others like it. And some years on, through a combination of spraying, digging, and replanting with competitive buffalo grass, the lawn is now free of bindii. So my parents' persistence, together with a range of control techniques, the main one being this competitive buffalo grass, was the key to their success. And so my parents were able to take a lawn like that you can see in the top picture, where there's a heavy infestation of bindii, and turn it into a gap-free and bindii-free sward of buffalo grass, as you can see in the picture below. So what my parents demonstrated to me, as others have concluded before, is that it's a fact of biological life that if one organism, in this case buffalo grass, occupies a particular space in an ecosystem, then another organism cannot do so. So fact of biological life, that if one organism occupies a particular space in an ecosystem, then another organism cannot do so. Well, the corollary of what my parents taught me in the garden in Sydney is that perhaps the reason we have weeds in pastures is because there are gaps or spaces in those pastures, and weeds are able to take advantage of those gaps. Now, while we might be inclined to apportion some blame for our weed problems on poor weed control by our neighbours, or dry seasons, indeed drought, or indeed ineffective legislation or extension by the government, and all those factors may play a part, and I'd be happy to take questions on those aspects later. Those factors may well be beyond our control. And so we need to think whether there is something which we can do ourselves about our weed problems that addresses the more fundamental issue. So let's take a moment then to consider what a pasture is like. And I appreciate that what I'm about to show you is a generalised picture, which will vary from place to place, but I think it's helpful in understanding why we have weeds like the serrated tussock that I showed you earlier, and many others in our paddocks. So pastures are typically comprised of 20 to 30 different species of plants in any one location, whether it be around northeast Victoria or indeed elsewhere. And these species can be divided roughly into two principal groups. Firstly, there are the matrix species, which are generally the long-lived perennial grasses, species like phalaris, tall fescue, cocksfoot, kikuyu. These matrix species are the backbone of the pasture. Secondly, there are the interstitial species that live in the gaps between the matrix species. Now, these may be annual or short-lived perennial grasses. They may be legumes such as clovers, and a variety of other annual species that take advantage of those gaps, and some of which will inevitably be weedy species. So these interstitial species may come and go depending on the season, depending on whether the gaps are there and other conditions are suitable, mainly temperature and moisture availability. For example, at least in some parts of New South Wales, and I'm sure the same would be true in northeastern Victoria, if there's a failure of late summer, early autumn rains, this is likely to open up pastures under grazing and predispose them to high weed risk when rains do fall. Now, some regenerative spaces are often needed for the establishment of annual legumes, but all other factors being the same, the greater the proportion of bare ground there is in a pasture, the more susceptible it is to seedling recruitment and invasion by weeds. And because annual species leave ground bare for part of the year, pastures based on annual plants are generally more prone to invasion by weeds than those with a more stable background matrix of perennial species. Likewise, activities that may disturb or weaken the matrix species, like herbicide use, cultivation, and grazing can potentially create or enlarge those gaps and make it possible for more interstitial weeds to germinate and be recruited into the pastures. And if the matrix species themselves are replaced by weeds, then you really have a major problem. Now, in this regards, animals, we need to think of them as much more than harvesting machines. They indeed affect the pasture and the possibility for weed recruitment as much as the pasture affects the animals. So the management of grazing becomes very crucial in weed control. Now, it's often said that a picture tells 1,000 words, so I'm going to use 3 illustrations to illustrate some of the things that I've been saying. This first is of a much younger me at one of my research sites on the south coast of New South Wales during my PhD. The situation is a kikuyu-based pasture, which has a light scattered infestation of fireweed plants, as you can see in the background, just a light yellow tinge there. As one of our treatments in preparation for sowing a different pasture species, what we've done in this experiment, we applied a non-selective herbicide to kill the pasture on the left-hand side of the screen. And with that suppression of the matrix grass, up jumps fireweed out of the ground. Whereas on the right of the screen, where the existing pasture was not treated with herbicide, there is very little fireweed. So this clearly illustrates the effect of weakening the matrix species on the invasion of weeds. Likewise, in the second photo from a paddock, again in northern New South Wales, there is the odd fireweed plant on the left of the picture, where the pasture has been left undisturbed. But where the pasture was cultivated on the right to sow a crop, there fireweed has been actively recruited. So what happens is disturbance, like cultivation, leads to gaps, which leads to fireweed. Thirdly, in a paddock from Gloucester, again in northern New South Wales, where the desirable matrix and other interstitial pasture species have been weakened and gaps created through set stocking and selective grazing, there the fireweed has also found an opportunity to thrive. Okay, so if gaps are there in the pastures, and they could have been created by one of these disturbances that I've just spoken about, or there may be other reasons such as drought, why do weeds like fireweed fill those gaps? In some respects, as I've already mentioned, the fireweed's my favourite weed, so I'll use it as an example, but it's not unlike many other pasture weeds that take advantage of such gaps in a pasture. But let's look just for a moment at some of its particular characteristics. And these would be similar with many pasture weeds. So fireweed is firstly poisonous and unpalatable to livestock, at least to cattle and to horses. And therefore it's rarely eaten. So this generally allows it to grow freely and to set seed. And these seeds, as you would possibly realise, are windborne, and in comparison with other windborne species, the aerodynamics of the fireweed seed makes it relatively effective in spreading the seed by wind. In fact, some people call it fireweed because it spreads like wildfire. Furthermore, seeds of fireweed can germinate and plants grow under a variety of environmental conditions. Our research showed that in central New South Wales, central coastal New South Wales, fireweed emergence peaked both in autumn and in spring, but the seedlings could be germinating at any time throughout the year. So it's very difficult to have one form of control at one particular time that's going to control all those plants. And typical of many pioneer species, fireweed is quick to flower, which allows it often to lay down more seed for future infestations before we as land managers get to control it. Moreover, fireweed can develop a large bank of seeds in the soil, some of which are long-lived and dormant for a period, particularly if they get buried, meaning that the weed will have seeds in the soil that can take advantage of gaps that may develop in the pasture several years after the seed may have arrived there. And weeds can have a much larger, extremely larger, much larger seed bank than the matrix species. So if there are gaps, the question remains, which species is going to fill them? Well, more than likely, those weedy species. And what I've shown you there at the bottom picture is a dense infestation of fireweed seedlings, which was measured at around about 5,000 seedlings per square metre. And when you think that the above ground weeds are generally around about 5% of what's below ground as seeds, then it means that the seed bank was probably far larger than that. So these are some of the reasons why our weedy species will indeed fill those gaps rather than our matrix species. And just to drive home this latter point of there being a large bank of weed seeds in the soil, here are some numbers for some other species from some studies that have been conducted on both weedy and non-weedy species. So if you look here, we've got two sets of plants here. We've got the reproductively efficient weeds, Spirobolus indicus, var major. This is a type of Parramatta grass. And in the soil, it's been measured that the seed range could be anywhere from 3,000 up to 25,000 seeds per square metre. On the other hand, from studies that we undertook at the University of New England on Chilean needlegrass, which is the second species down, you can see that the range of seed bank was from 3,500 seeds per square metre up to 11,000 seeds per square metre. So they're the two weedy species in our comparison. If you compare those with studies of some of the non-weedy species, Microlina stipoides, this is weeping grass, it's a native grass, well, a mere 169. Danthonia species, this is the old name for wallaby grasses, another native, only 90 seeds per square metre. Phalaris aquatica, 23 seeds per square metre. And common wheatgrass, this last species here, only 18 seeds per square metre. So you can see that the order of magnitude here difference between the weedy species and the desirable species is enormous. And so if there are gaps in a pasture, again, what's going to fill it? It's going to be often those weedy species. Furthermore, these weeds are likely to be long-lived. And here is the estimated decay curve for seeds of Chilean needlegrass, again from one of our studies at the University of New England. And you can see here that on the x-axis, we've got years without seed input. So this is assuming that there's no further seed being dropped onto the soil, and the soil seed bank in numbers per square metre. And you can see that it started off around about 4,500 seeds per square metre of Chilean needlegrass. And by year 5, although it's declined a great deal, you've still got 300 or 400 seeds per square metre. And even by year 10, there are still a few seeds in the soil. And so, again, likely that even though those seeds might be dropped at one time, if there are gaps that appear within that 10-year period, then again, the Chilean needlegrass may be the species that fills those gaps. Okay, so at the most fundamental level, then, many weeds are present because there are gaps in the pasture, which research suggests is most often caused by overgrazing and drought. Not all the time, but those are two of the key factors. And as you can see here in this first picture with Patterson's curse in a pasture just outside Wagga Wagga. It's a heavily grazed horse paddock, and the Patterson's curse, well, there's lots of bare ground there and plenty of Patterson's curse. On the other hand, we know from various studies that this and other weeds whose seed germination is promoted by light, it's far less likely to emerge from beneath a relatively competitive and shady pasture. Through the right sort of grazing and pasture management, this type of pasture is relatively closed to weed invasion. So many weeds of pastures are pioneer species. That is, they invade bare areas as the early stages of succession. Now, the extent, frequency and seasonality of disturbances like cultivation, overgrazing, poor herbicide use, these can be all major factors in determining which weeds invade your particular pasture at a particular time. Now, those pasture weeds, they often have things in common. They often have light seeds, and so they can be blown around very easily or move very easily from one place to another. They often have vigorous vegetative growth and are unpalatable species, obviously, to livestock. So I'll just give you a few examples. Spear thistle, for example. Yep, it's a competitive species. It's wind dispersed. It's an annual, so it tends to occur in those interstitial spaces, but it's unpalatable to livestock. So if it gets established, then it will continue to thrive. Another species, quite different, silverleaf nightshade. Here it has vigorous vegetative growth, and you can see something of the rhizomes that occur underground, very woody and a difficult plant to kill. It's a perennial plant, but again, it's unpalatable to livestock. So the different weeds have different advantages that allow them to persist in our pastoral environments. One that I've already spoken about, serrated tussock. Well, it's a highly invasive weed. The seed heads break off and blow in the wind, and they can blow for several kilometres. So it's wind dispersed, it's highly invasive. Again, it's a perennial and it's highly unpalatable to livestock. And then another one I've mentioned, Patterson's curse. Again, it's a competitive, in this case, it's an annual, but again, it's poisonous to livestock. So all these species have different ways that they survive within a pasture environment, but they do often have some similar characteristics as well. So the things, when you come to manage your weeds, what you need to try and discover is, well, where are those weeds on your property? What are they? Identifying those species, and particularly after drought, sometimes you'll get new species popping up, and it's important to identify what those are or have them sent off to be identified. To learn whether they're annuals or biennials or perennials. Do they last just for a year or do they last over several years? Because that's going to impact on our weed management strategies. When do they germinate? When do they flower? And when do they set seed? That's going to be important in managing them as well. Do they have a long or a short-lived soil seed bank? So how long do we need to persist for? What conditions favour their growth? Can we predict when they're going to occur? How do they spread? Can we stop that in any way? Are they eaten by livestock? Can we utilise our livestock indeed to manage the weed and perhaps even eat it? And do those weeds have any weaknesses that can be exploited? For example, serrated tussock has a very tiny seedling. It's a very weak seedling, and if you can hit the serrated tussock when it's very young, it's very susceptible to competition and other forms of weed control like herbicides. So what do we do then if we've got weed problems in our pastures? Before I go into some of the specifics, I want to mention just some findings of a national survey we undertook of livestock producers in Australia a number of years ago as to what livestock producers have found from their many years of experience to be the keys to successful weed management more generally in pastures. And helpfully, the three key concepts that they identified all start with the letter D. So those landholders, in one sense, have provided a 3D look at successful weed management. And I wonder if you can think of what those keys might be. Perhaps you even participated in the survey. Well, here are what the landholders told us. The first key to successful weed management was deliberation. In other words, having a plan based on an understanding of the weed's ecology, understanding all those things that I've just mentioned about how the weed operates. Not rocket science, having a plan, but it's key to success. Secondly, diversity. You need to combine a series of weed control measures, each of which places different constraints on weed growth, on reproduction, and on the spread of the weed. And you might ask, well, why diversity? Why is that important? Well, history shows that continued use of any weed control method will inevitably favour survival of weeds resistant to that method. So if you're always slashing your pasture, like mowing a lawn, you'll end up with prostrate weeds, weeds that are very low to the ground. If you're grazing continually, then you'll end up with weeds that are unpalatable to livestock or poisonous. If you're using herbicides repeatedly over and over again, then you'll end up with weeds that are resistant to those herbicides. So diversity is also a key. And then the third key to success is diligence. Again, not rocket science, but because of the persistence and spread of weeds, one really needs to stick at it. So those are what the overarching sort of things that we need to consider when we're designing our weed management strategy as the framework within which we work. So what tools do we have available at our disposal in our attempts to manage these weeds? Well, a helpful way of looking at these tools or methods is to think of them either as weed removers and/or pasture improvers. There will not be much benefit if we remove a particular weed, but the pasture remains susceptible to invasion. Because of the seed bank in the soil and the ability of the weeds to spread, those weeds are likely to return again and again. As you could already guess from my talk so far, the primary emphasis, I believe, needs to be on methods to close the gaps in our pasture. So in other words, pasture improvers. You may, however, need a method to remove existing weed plants, particularly with a dense infestation like that of the serrated tussock that I showed you earlier. But a dense pasture, when the weed in question is emerging, is likely to provide the best long-term form of control because it will be resilient to future invasions. So what techniques are weed removers? Well, there's some overlap between these techniques. Some have benefits for weed removing and also pasture improving, but in general, weed removers, these are the reactive methods when there's a weed there. Things like herbicides, hand weeding, biological control, if that's available for your particular weed, targeted grazing, such as with sheep or goats, which will often graze certain weeds that other livestock won't touch, and then slashing. Pasture improvers, on the other hand, well, the techniques that are going to stop a weed from reinvading your pasture in future are things like fertiliser application or irrigation prior to the active growth period of your pastures. So timing for those is critical. And these are the proactive techniques. Grazing management, such as rotational grazing, that avoids overgrazing and allows for rest periods to thicken up the pastures, particularly prior to high weed germination times, and also when the matrix species are seeding, to allow them to drop those seeds on the soil and to bulk up the seed bank of the desirable species to lessen those gaps. And in some situations where the matrix species are particularly sparse, for example, following a drought, or they're not well suited to the environment, then the re-establishment of suitable locally adapted competitive pastures may be warranted. But there are risks with resowing, which I'm happy to discuss later if there are any questions about that. Okay, so we have some principles by which to work on our weed problem, as well as some weed control methods. But what will your specific goal be for your property? Now, I hear a lot of people talk, and a lot of students at the university talk about eradication of weeds. But eradication, which means reducing the population of weeds to zero, is rarely ever achieved, except when infestations are relatively small and detected very early in the invasion process. So because of this, the goal for most landholders is unlikely to be eradication of a weed, but rather to reduce the population to a manageable level that has minimal impact on pasture and livestock production. So here are some examples, some specifics of approaches that one might take if one had fireweed, and I'm just using that as an example. And it really depends on the severity of the weed infestation as well as the weed growth stage, the situation or site in which you're controlling it, and the sort of resources that you have available. But here are just 3 examples of what one's goals might be for fireweed and the most likely methods that you might use. So you can see here in the table, the first little category is where the infestation might be new or small, isolated. Well, your aim or goal might be to remove all plants regularly to prevent reinfestation and drive down the soil seed bank. So what methods might you use? Well, farm hygiene might be critical. Stopping weeds coming onto the property through hay and other means, actually carrying out hand weeding because it's only a small infestation, and spot spraying a selective herbicide to kill the weed but not the pasture. If on the other hand you've got a light infestation of the weed across a widespread area, as in this photograph on the right hand side here in the middle, well, your goal might be to maintain a low population level that doesn't allow build-up of seed numbers in the soil. So the techniques you might use or the methods might be pasture competition particularly, good grazing management, and just the occasional or strategic hand weeding or spot spraying of selective herbicide. If on the other hand you've got a heavy infestation, well, your aim here or your goal might be to reduce the population to a manageable level that has minimal impact on pasture and livestock, because at the high density level, you think it's going to be having that impact on livestock. So your methods here, well, it may involve a broadacre selective herbicide across the whole paddock. It will again involve pasture and grazing management and pasture competition. So when using these weed control methods, you may indeed be achieving several more specific aims, which are summarised in this slide. And while I've placed considerable emphasis on number 1, depleting the weed seed bank and stopping emergence, so the pasture improving, equally important in reducing weed population numbers can be stopping weed seed set, number 3. And you might, for example, do that through timely slashing. Or in times of drought, preventing spread from outside your farm might be more critical. For example, making sure that you import only clean grain and fodder that's free of weeds. Okay, so what I want to do just is to look here at one example for Patterson's curse of a planner or a plan that may be used to manage Patterson's curse in a pasture. And this is courtesy of the Meat and Livestock Australia. They've published this. And you'll see that timing is critical, and potentially in aligning your understanding of your weed and your pasture. And again, what they've done here is they've divided their tactics or their methods of control between weed removing and pasture improving. So if we just look at this planner, you'll see here that across the top, we have the pasture growing from autumn through winter, spring and summer. And the weed, Patterson's curse, are also doing this, having this similar life cycle. So germinating mostly in autumn, growing through winter, flowering, and then haying off in summer. So tactics to reduce germination and seeding. So these are the weed removal techniques. Well, maintaining, and as I said, there is some overlap between the weed removing and pasture improving techniques, but maintaining a relatively high level of dry matter in your pasture of 1,500 kilograms of dry matter per hectare. That's about 150 grams of dry matter per square metre. In the autumn period prior to the germination of Patterson's curse, and also over the summer period leading into the autumn period, that's going to prevent a lot of Patterson's curse from germinating and establishing if there's that cover of pasture. So the gaps are being removed. Then combine that with early application of herbicide when the Patterson's curse in its early stages of growth in this early winter period before it sets seed. So controlling it when it's most susceptible, but before it sets seed. Biological control, which is available for Patterson's curse, that's going to be acting throughout that whole growth period. Now, if you've got a low infestation of Patterson's curse, it may be possible, even though it's a poisonous weed, to utilise your livestock to actually control some of the weed. And so here, if you've got a very low infestation, and of course it's less likely to do damage to your livestock. With a low infestation, you may be able to rest the pasture in the autumn period so that it's more competitive. And what happens, Patterson's curse, if there's not much competition, it will grow very flat on the ground, very prostrate leaves. But if there's a bit of competition, it will start to grow more upright, the leaves. And then when the livestock, if you then follow that up with high density grazing, then the livestock will actually consume some of that Patterson's curse and kill many of the plants. And I'll show you a picture in a moment of that same principle with saffron thistle, which I have a picture of rather than Patterson's curse. But then you're combining in your planner, you're combining also the possibility in a low infestation where there's not much weed in the pasture, you may be able to cut the pasture for hay or silage. And because of the low amount of Patterson's curse in there, it's not going to be a threat for poisoning of the livestock, but you are going to remove the plant before it sets seed. And so again, you have that possibility of reducing the number of seeds going back into the soil. So those are largely weed removing techniques. Then the pasture improving techniques, tactics, well, they've called it here tactics to boost desirable species. Well, application of fertiliser prior to the high growth period of your pasture species. Deferring grazing, in other words, withdrawing your stock off the particular paddock late in spring and summer so that there's a build-up of pasture mass on the soil surface, which is then going to stop seedlings from germinating in the following season. And then rotational grazing. Rotational grazing is very critical when it comes to managing the weeds rather than set stocking. So this is a good example of a plan for one particular weed based on an understanding of the timing of the pasture and the timing of the life cycle characteristics of the weed in question. And this is the photo that I just wanted to show you of the use of animals or deferring grazing before the germination of a weed like Patterson's curse or saffron thistle. In this, for those of you who know what saffron thistle normally looks like, it's again a very prostrate seedling. It grows flat on the ground, and it's even hard for sheep to pick it up off the ground in its early stages. It's so flat, but it has no spines when it's young. And if you provide enough competition in the autumn period when it's germinating, then it'll actually look like this. It grows very upright, still no spines. And if you then follow that up with some intense grazing, then the livestock will actually nip off the growing buds of the saffron thistle, and the saffron thistle plant will die. So it's a really good way of controlling saffron thistle. Understanding how the weed works and how the pasture works, and then utilising your animals in that way. Okay, so what will you do to bring your personal plan together? As I said earlier, I can't answer that specifically for you as I don't know your particular situation. But I sum up by making the following points, and then we can have some questions. In your deliberations and formulation of a plan for any weed, and that's the first D of success, having a plan, use a combination of weed removing and pasture improving techniques. That's the diversity that farmers spoke to us about. And the goal with pasture improving techniques, of course, is to maintain and promote a thick competitive pasture, to close the gaps, to suppress germination and emergence of weeds. And as well, anything that you can do to prevent seed set of your weeds will also be advantageous for reducing the soil weed seed bank over time. Now, I hear a lot of people, when they think about weed control, they automatically think about herbicides. Remember that herbicides, or that once weed plants reach maturity, they're much more difficult to control with herbicides. So they need to be used early on in the life cycles. But also remember, herbicides are short-term solutions generally, and pasture improvement should be the long-term goal. And then finally in your plan, you need to stick to your plan. Diligence is the third and an important key to success. And just as my parents demonstrated to me many years ago the benefits of their perseverance with bindii, so you can achieve a level of control with your weeds whereby you no longer consider them to be a major problem on your property. So with that, I'm happy to take questions and answer those as best as I can. And I think Alandi will manage those, but you can type those into the question and answer box on your screen.
Thank you, Brian. And apologies to everyone, we are having a few technical difficulties tonight. My internet is still struggling with the storms we've had through recently. If you use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to answer any, to type in any questions, that'd be great. But I do have a couple of questions actually, Brian, that we might start things off while people are getting a chance to type any questions in. So considering this program is looking at helping us to recover from drought, one of the, and I guess this year is a bit of an unusual year because it has been very wet for us and we have a lot of grass and a lot of weeds around at the moment as well. But if landholders are going through a recovery or period and come into that recovery period, what would sort of be some of your advice to those landholders?
Yeah, we've also had drought up in this part of the world as well, and it was interesting to see that there were many weed species that came into the pastures which people hadn't seen for a long time. So they were ones that were obviously they had the right conditions through that drought, long periods of dry followed by wet conditions. But following drought, I think what the key thing is to focus on having or re-establishing or making sure that your matrix species, those perennial grasses, get fully established before hitting them with too much grazing. I noticed that some perennial grasses will recover well themselves. I noticed around here that, or even in my lawn, even though it was bare dirt for many months, once the rains came, the couch grass was able to come back and it thickened up and it recovered very well, but it needed time to do that. So I think focusing on that matrix species, if they don't re-establish well, the perennials themselves, then it may be a consideration that you do need to re-sow. If you do re-sow, then just remember that one of the risks of re-sowing is that often you have to have a bare paddock to re-sow. And so again, that opens up the possibility of weed invasion. So you need to be prepared to manage those pioneer weedy species that are going to germinate very quickly and compete with your perennial species that you might be sowing early on. So an early spray with a selective herbicide might be required.
I was thinking. Now, just I've got a question come in that says, given your comment about not relying on herbicide, is herbicide resistance a factor or of relevance to the weed control plan?
I think what I was saying is that herbicides can certainly be an important tool in your toolbox for managing weeds, but you shouldn't rely on them wholly and solely. Foundational, as I said, needs to be your matrix species, your pasture improvement, so that the pasture is the long-term competitor with the weeds. But if you've got a problem, say, of established serrated tussock with mature plants, no matter how competitive your pasture becomes, it's not going to kill those serrated tussock plants. They've already got a foothold. And so you may need to either, for example, chip them out or spot spray them or use the herbicide in that way. So certainly herbicides have a place, but they shouldn't be relied on. And it is the case that although most herbicide resistance develops within cropping areas where herbicides are used more frequently, there are cases of herbicide-resistant serrated tussock that have been found both in northern New South Wales and in Victoria. So where people have used herbicides over and over again for pasture weeds, that can become a problem.
No worries, thank you. Now, just another question I've got come in is, do you think the weeds are a cause of or a symptom of pasture degradation?
Yeah, good question. I guess from what I've been saying mostly, I've been suggesting to you that weeds are in fact a symptom of pasture degradation, and the pasture degradation may be as a result of natural causes like drought, but it could also be as a result of overgrazing or from some of those other factors, disturbance factors that I mentioned before. But rather than being one or the other, I think weeds are then also a cause of pasture degradation, because particularly if they're annual species, I didn't show it to you, but a Pattersons curse plant, for example, which is an annual, it has a very prostrate and broad leaf and it can cover, or spear thistle itself can cover, anywhere up to 1 metre square just in one plant. And so what that does is it grows for that maybe 6 months of the year. It then dies, and what it does, of course, is it leaves a lot of bare ground, but that weed is also set seed, and those seeds will drop onto that bare ground, and they will be the ones to reinfest that area. So weeds are, in fact, both a symptom of pasture degradation, but also then they can be an ongoing cause. They're self-sustaining as a weed infestation, pasture degradation tool. So, yeah, it's both.
No worries, thank you. Yeah, just another one around rotational grazing. So you mentioned that throughout your presentation, and that's obviously something that's talked about quite regularly with best practice management for a lot of our grazing systems.
Yep.
So how does rotational grazing help with weed control?
Yep, sure. So another good question. Yeah, so if you compare that with what maybe traditionally was done, set stocking, where you just put livestock into a paddock and leave them in those paddocks to graze the desirable species. What they do, they're very selective. They tend to eat all the plants that are more palatable and more nutritious and softer, and they leave the weeds. And of course, that then leaves those weeds to reproduce and set seed and increase the weed population of seeds in the soil. Whereas, so you're exacerbating the weed problem through that set stocking. Rotational grazing, on the other hand, where you have a larger quantity of livestock in an area for a shorter period of time, and then you move them on from place to place, you remove some of that selectivity of the livestock. So rather than just eating the highly desirable species, they will graze some of the less desirable species. And some of those, like chili needlegrass, can be quite nutritious in their early stages. They're not all bad. They can have some very good qualities if they're in the right stage. And so you get the chili needlegrass actually consumed by the livestock, and so you're actually suppressing those weeds. And at the same time, by then resting the pasture, when you take the livestock out and move them to another area, then you're allowing that pasture to rest and regrow and become more competitive at different times throughout the year when they can compete better with those weedy species. So rotational grazing really is, and there's all sorts of terms and forms of rotational grazing, but at its core, that needs to be the way that we outgraze our pastures primarily.
No, thank you. Well, thank you everyone for joining tonight. I think the analogy around using flies as an example is actually really good for our area, because we have heliotrope is a very similar weed in a lot of contexts to fireweed, I think, in our region, and very prominent at the moment. So there's some good outcomes through that presentation that people can apply to that as well. So thank you, Brian, for giving up your time tonight and presenting to us. It was very informative, and thank you to everyone for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks very much, Alandi.